Hello, my name is Darrell Robert Schoen, and in 2007, when I presented my paper before the Positive Deviant Network predicting a catastrophic economic collapse was about to happen, there was also in that report, 148-page paper, a prediction that a new America would arise. Now, this is 8 years later after I presented that paper. I wrote the paper in 2006, so this is 9 years after I wrote that paper. And on the last program, it was basically, I was talking about the coming Second American Revolution. And in this program, I'm going to talk about why it is going to be like a revolution. In a sense, we are, as a humanity, as individuals, and as a group, we're here at an extraordinary time on the planet. And what we don't realize, or haven't realized before, is that the shift is, in a sense, preordained. We are here at a time of great history and of great change without knowing it. We came here and we wanted it to be easier. There's a saying that there's a Chinese curse saying that may you be born in interesting times. And I think what we've discovered is these are indeed interesting, far more interesting than we would have chosen on our own, but that's not our choice, at least not volitionally after we got here. Those choices were made out of time and space, and that a history was already in motion when we came here. And so it is. In my book, my 148-page report, which became a book and was ordered in 25 countries, basically after 2007 when I put it on the internet, I said something in the book about a new version of America. I called it America version 2.0. And I said we were at the time living in America version 1.0. And America 1.0 was very, very different than the version of America handed to us by the Founding Fathers. The America that came into being in 1776 bears little resemblance to the America that I wrote about in 2007. The America that I wrote about in 2007 was so different than that envisioned by the Founding Fathers, other than the name. There was little difference. The America envisioned by the Founding Fathers in 1776 was such a difference than any other country that had gone before it. It was founded in the sense of freedom. It was founded as a basis not only of civil freedom, but of religious freedom. Thomas Jefferson himself said that ever since the beginning of history, the priest has been an enemy of freedom. Now, why is this so? This is because the priests have believed that generally they're right. In fact, convinced of it beyond the shadow of a doubt. And this has given those who represent or purport to represent truth, religious freedom, truth, are more than willing to cram it down the throats of their fellow men. We talk about the pilgrims coming to America, fleeing religious oppression in Europe. Well, if you have a reading of history and those pilgrims, you will find that basically they were given the boot out of Europe, out of England, because they were so intolerant about their fellow Catholics, Huguenots, whatever they were, that they were basically kicked out of Europe. And they went to the United States, was going to become the United States. They went to the New World because of their intolerance about the religious practices of their fellow man. They may have been right. The intolerance was not. And so they came to America, and the revolution that happened, the Founding Fathers decided that this new country, which they're going to call the United States of America, was to have embedded in its Constitution the concept of religious freedom. That no matter what the religious belief, that you could choose to practice it here, along with those who had no, quote, formal religious belief. There was to be religious freedom in this new country. This new country was also to be founded upon the premise of limited government. That the government would no longer have the ability to tax as they did in England. No longer have the ability to set money out of a central bank as they did in England. The United States government was founded by revolutionaries, founded against the tyranny of government authority in civil and religious matters, and it was a breath of fresh air. It was such a breath of fresh air that the very name America became synonymous with the word freedom. But over the course of the next 200 years, that vision not only was changed, it was turned on its head. The United States of America, a nation born in the dream of freedom from tyranny, became a tyrannical force in its own right. 200 years later, indeed 250 years later, we became the very thing that we had fought against. We became an empire like England that we had fought against. Rather than the dream of freedom, we became the greatest imposition of empire on the earth. And so it was when I wrote my book in 2007. I said we had a chance, that America had a choice in front of us to rekindle that dream of freedom. And at the end of my book, Time of the Vulture, in which I predicted an economic collapse, I said there were going to be 4 markers that was going to determine whether or not we were going to volitionally choose to become what I called America 2.0, version 2, a rebirth of the great dream that was handed to us by the Founding Fathers. Let me tell you what I wrote. America 2.0, topic 36 in my book, Time of the Vulture, posted on the internet in 2007, sold in 25 countries, ordered in 25 countries. And what I said is this. In 2006, when I wrote these words, it cannot be said America is yet in a crisis mood. And the reason why I said it was that it was an extraordinary book published in 1997 by 2 American historians, William Strauss and Neil Howe. They published a book called The Fourth Turning. And based on past historical cycles, Strauss and Howe predicted that another important turn in American history was about to occur. I'm going to read you what they wrote in their book published in 1997. They called it The Fourth Turning. And they said this. Around the year 2005, which is 8 years after their book was published, they said this. A sudden spark will catalyze a crisis mood. Remnants of the old social order will disintegrate. Political and economic trust will implode. Real hardship will beset the land. With severe distress that could involve questions of class, race, nation, and empire. Yet this time of trouble will bring seeds of social rebirth. Americans will share a regret about recent mistakes and a resolute new consensus about what to do. The very survival of the nation will feel at stake. Sometimes before the year 2025, America will pass through a great gate in history, commensurate with the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the twin emergencies of the Great Depression and World War II. The risk of catastrophe will be very high. The nation could erupt into insurrection or civil violence, crack up geographically, or succumb to authoritarian rule. If there is a war, it is likely to be one of maximum risk and effort. In other words, a total war. This is a quote from The Fourth Turning, written by historians William Strauss and Neil Howe, published in 1997. Well, as prescient as their words were in 1997, that great crisis that they predicted would begin around 2005 was slightly delayed. Issues of class and race have arisen in America. The word 1% is in our common parlance, and it wasn't in 1997 when they wrote those words. The 99% know that the word 1% refers to the elite economic, political, and financial groups that run this country. The issues of race that they talked about in The Fourth Turning have come front and center, not in 2005, but in 2014, with the shooting of Trayvon Martin in Florida, the killing that happened in Ferguson, the police, in a year, the very year the United States Supreme Court ruled that we could roll back the Civil Rights Act because racial justice is no longer an issue in America. The fact that the Supreme Court of the land has said that is one indication of how disconnected the elites are from the reality of today. When I wrote my book in 2006, I presented it in 2007, I talked about America 2.0, an America that could come volitionally if we chose another path. And I said in this book there were 4 markers by which we could determine whether or not we had made that choice for the rebirth of a new America. The markers were this. I said, America version 1.0 is at the end of its cycle. I wrote these words in 2006. America version 2.0 has not yet been released. Empires, like products, come with expiration dates. Some products, like George Lucas's Star Wars and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, produce successful sequels. Most do not. Empires, as a rule, fall into the latter category. It is perhaps to America's fortune that its most recent attempt at empire was unsuccessful. And in this, I'm referring to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Because America's immense influence in the 20th century was built less on coercion than on the momentum of universal ideas such as freedom and opportunity, America has a chance to regain that which it so recently lost. Leadership, real leadership, unlike power, is bestowed by others on those believed deserving. 4 markers, 3 obvious and 1 not, will be telling indicators if America can regain the moral authority to lead. I wrote these words in 2006. The markers are 1. Global warming. 2. Honest voting in America. 3. Israel and Middle East policy. And 4. The repayment of billions of dollars missing from the American Indian Trust Fund. These were 4 markers that I chose because there was a moral component to each of the markers. Leadership from coercion and power isn't leadership. It's tyranny. It's force. Leadership from moral choice is real leadership. And I use these 4 markers as a future indicator whether or not America will deserve the moral leadership that will arise from a volitional choice of a new America, what I called version 2.0. This is 9 years later after I wrote those words, really 8.5. And let me go through those markers. The first one, global warming. Well, almost 10 years after I wrote those words, America's stance on global warming is about as equivocal as not having done anything. I read today in the news that there was a group gathering that congratulated themselves prior to the meeting in Paris that's going to happen on climate change. And all these politicians look so happy. Oh, they look so confident. Why? They had just come to a conclusion that they were going to, as a group of nations, including the United States, reduce greenhouse emissions by 40% by 2030. That's like your uncle, a hardcore alcoholic, congratulating himself that he is going to cut down on his alcohol intake by 40% by 2030. Well, that's self-congratulation at its highest. A significant number, 40%, in the next 15 years. That doesn't show resolve. That shows the public relations gesture of a nation still run by vested interest in big oil. A commitment to a necessary change on paper, not worth the paper it's printed on. That was the first marker that I said would be a telling indicator of America that was to assume the moral leadership necessary for version 2.0. The second indicator, the second marker I wrote, honest voting in America. Now, why did I write that? I wrote those words in 2006 because perhaps the most significant election that had happened in recent history was the 2000 elections and 2004. Well, what happened in the 2000 election? The 2000 election was a hotly contested presidential race between the Republicans and the Democrats, where George Bush was elected after a deadlock that came down over the state of Florida. All right? And there was a question. This election was going to be consequential because George Bush was going to take the presidency and plunge the United States into a war on false pretenses. They were going to claim that this country, Iraq, was somehow instrumental in an event that was going to happen 1 year later. 9/11. And based on the fabrication of lies they said came from the CIA, and it did, but there were reports within the CIA that the information itself was flimsy at best. as we were to find out. This was an election of a president that was going to change the course of American history for the worst. Under the Bush's leadership, we were not only going to fight a war in the Middle East that was without foundation, we're going to plunge the United States economy into chaos with a collapse in 2000 and another collapse 7 to 8 years later with the real estate bubble. But let us not lay this all at the foot of George Bush, especially the economic collapse. The road had been paved in 1999 when Democrat Bill Clinton, William Jefferson Clinton, signed the repeal of Glass-Steagall, an act put into practice in 1934 at the depth of the Great Depression. An event so catastrophic, had they not reflated markets with total government support, asking nothing from Wall Street in the Great Depression, we'd still be mired in an economic rendering of which the world had never before seen. But we had. And the Glass-Steagall Act said no longer was it going to be possible for the investment banks of Wall Street to bet the savings of Americans in the casino called the stock markets. And so in 1934, a line was drawn between investment banking on one hand and commercial banking on the other. Because in 1929, the investment banks had bet the savings of commercial banks in the casino of Wall Street, blew it up, and we had the Great Depression. So in the midst of the economic carnage of the 1930s, America chose never to let this happen again. And in 1999, William Jefferson Clinton signed into reality an act repealing Glass-Steagall. An act that was going to have catastrophic consequences within 7 years. 8 years. Within 8 years, we were going to have 2 bubbles collapse based upon what Glass-Steagall aimed to prevent. Ladies and gentlemen, the economic collapse that I predicted in my book, Time of the Vulture, is gratis of both political parties. Now I know those of you who are still focused in on the two-party system would like to blame the other party for the problems you are now having. I want to assure you it was a bipartisan effort. William Clinton had let Goldman Sachs into the Democratic Party in 1992 because of the inability of the Democrats to challenge the Republicans ever since the 1960s and 1970s on equal footing. He let them in and sold out the country. In the next program, I'll tell you why it is going to take a collapse of a magnitude of the Great Depression to right the ship that was sunk. I was talking about, in my book, Time of the Vulture, which was posted on the internet as a report, as a book, in 2007. I began writing it in 2006. I predicted not only a catastrophic economic collapse, even greater than the Great Depression, was about to happen, but I also predicted that a new America would arise. An America I called version 2.0. America had turned into the very anathema of a country the Founding Fathers had created in 1776. A dream of freedom so great that the word America became associated with freedom itself. But by the end of the 20th century, and certainly by the beginning of the 21st, we had turned that dream into an abomination of the dream that the Founding Fathers had created with blood 250 years, 300 years before. A dream founded on freedom, we had become an empire ourselves. And when I wrote those words in 2006, 2007, the words of the fact of America 1.1, we had become a carbon copy, virtually, of that which we professed to oppose. We had justified torture, invasion, oppression, and tyranny, all in the name of freedom. And I wrote that in a book called The Fourth Turning by Strauss and Howe, published in 1997. They said America would undergo a crisis sometimes after 2005. A crisis in which Americans would confront race, class, questions of empire, on a level that was going to shake this nation to its roots. And so in my book I said there were going to be 4 markers that I was going to look at that would tell if America had turned the corner and could provide the moral leadership so lacking in our present nation. The first marker was global warming. And I showed in the last program how this not had happened at all. We were just making a mockery of the words of cutting back global emissions, greenhouse emissions. And the second marker was called fair in voting. Why? Because I had pointed out that the election of 2007 was a stolen election. Stolen with the consent of the Democrats who lost the election. When that election went down to the wire, all that was needed, all that was required to force an examination of the 2000 election, an election that was to set America on a course of tyranny and empire under the, quote, leadership of those behind George Bush II. All that was needed was one senator to stand up in the Senate. And not one did. Not one Democratic senator stood to challenge an election stolen by the Republicans. Which means that the Democrats were in on the theft. They assented to a theft that was to change the course of American history. Al Gore didn't have the balls to stand up. Why? He was part of the sellout, as was the Democratic Party. And in ensuing years, no great changes were made to the electronic voting system that allowed the theft of that election. Every subsequent election happened with the ability to steal that election still in place. And so, the first marker, global warming, the second marker, fair elections, went by the wayside. Nothing has been stolen on the level of the 2000 elections. Didn't need to. The boys who run America are still in control and are quite happy with the way that it's turned out. And that's why I'm going to say, by the end of this program, why a new American Revolution is about to happen. Because in the 8 years since then, the American electorate has gotten even more dissatisfied for reasons I intend to cover in this show. The third marker was Israel. Israel. First marker, global warming, honest voting in America. And the third marker I wrote in my book, Time of the Vulture, Israel and Middle East Policy. In this book, I talked about Israel in 2006. And I pointed out two events that had happened. Well, the first event, the major event, was the USS Liberty. Very few Americans know about the USS Liberty. In 1996, during the Six-Day War, an American surveillance ship was off the coast of Israel, monitoring events that were going on. And the Israelis, which wanted to make their war look like a provoked attack by Egypt, knew that the presence of an American surveillance ship would blow their excuse out of the water. So out of the blue, as the Six-Day War began, Israeli jets strafed the USS Liberty, resulting in the loss of lives and the almost sinking of the ship. When the USS Liberty radioed for help, the Mideast Fleet sent planes, American planes, to defend the USS Liberty. And as those planes were in the air, the Mideast Fleet got a phone call from Lyndon Baines Johnson telling those planes to return and not come to the aid of the USS Liberty. And they did. But the Israelis, knowing that planes were on their way, backed off. The USS Liberty, with all those dead, strafed by the Israeli Air Force, which said, oh, it was a case of mistaken identity. Let me assure you, that was a lie. One of many told by the State of Israel and allowed by the United States to stay. Why? Because I wrote in this book, it showed the immense power and influence of the State of Israel over the United States and England. In 1947, before the State of Israel was even established, when Israel was only an idea of a protectorate in the Middle East, England, its sponsoring state, had its headquarters in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And Jewish terrorists, led by a terrorist who was later going to become prime minister of the later state of Israel, Menachem Begin, bombed the King David Hotel, resulting in the loss of life. And what did England do? Nothing. Just like the United States in 1996. Years later, did nothing when they were attacked by the now state of Israel. I point those two incidences out to you because it shows the immense influence of this country that in 1947 was not yet even a country, that had the temerity to attack the hand that gave it existence on the planet, England. And in 1996 had the temerity to attack its protector, the United States of America. And both did nothing. And I pointed this out in my book because I said, unless the United States regained the moral authority to call a spade, to call a rogue state, to call a crime, we would still be bowing to power. And what power did Israel have over the United States and the UK that gave it the ability to attack without retribution? It was the power of money. The State of Israel is at the core of the banking system that gave England its power over the world, and they gave America its great military-industrial complex. And I said in this book, 4 markers would show whether or not the United States had the moral leadership to bring America 2.0 into being? Well, we just had in the last week the Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, sponsored by the Republican Party, to issue a rebuke of American foreign policy in the United States Congress. And let me assure you, those who sponsored him, the right wing of the Republican Party, in the last election it signed a pledge in 2008, pledging that they would not cut $1 from monies allocated to the State of Israel. When I found that out, I thought, isn't that treason? Every one of those congressmen who had signed that pledge not to cut $1 from monies going from the United States of America to a foreign state, that they would cut dollars from monies going to Americans first before they would dare cut $1 from the billions given to the state of Israel. In my mind, that's tantamount to treason. And so here we are 8 years later. Marker number 3. Like marker number 1, global warming. Like marker number 2, fair elections, out the window. There was one final marker that I put down in my book that would show if America had gained the moral authority to lead and to bring America 2.0 into existence. And it was called, it's great, the repayment of billions of dollars missing from the American Indian Trust Fund. Now, when I wrote that book, this trust fund that was allegedly run out of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it's a battle between American Indian tribes and the Bureau of Indian Affairs over funds that were missing from the trust fund established by the United States government to oversee billions of dollars that were supposed to be collected by the Bureau of Indian Affairs on behalf of the Indian nations which it represented, and had given away royalties on lands, on leases for oil, for gold, for grazing rights, on Indian lands ceded to the Indian nations by the United States government, of which the United States government was going to act as trustee for these Indian nations, impoverished, health standards into the dirt, and going to collect monies due to these nations negotiated on their behalf by the American government. In a lawsuit brought by the Indian nations, they said, we want an accounting of these funds. And so I wrote in 2006, this was the last marker that would determine whether or not Americans had regained the moral leadership to lead the world into the coming age, where we could see the rebirth of what I called America version 2.0. Well, folks, let me tell you what has happened since I wrote those words. A compromise was reached between the American Indian tribes and the United States government. And a payout of pennies on the dollar was negotiated. A payout that is yet to happen in 2015, even though the agreement was reached, probably 2011, 2012. This is 3 years later. Now, why was the payout reached for only pennies on the dollar? Because the United States Federal Appellate Court ruled that the American Indians, the plaintiffs in the case against the trustees, had no standing. Not standing. They had no right to require the Bureau of Indian Affairs to open their books and show what happened to the money. Isn't that something, folks? That the Indian nations had no right to examine the books of the Bureau of Indian Affairs that took in royalties over the past decades on behalf of those it was charged to oversee their interest in a just manner, and sent checks out from that fund. The Indians had no right to look at the books. Informed of this, the American Indians had no recourse but to fold. Because without the ability to examine the books, to examine what monies went in and what monies went out and to whom, they didn't have the proverbial leg to stand on. This was done in a court of law. A court of law. You know, America, I love your law and order, or what you call law and order. And I'm a little bit cynical about these things. I mean, with my 1 year of law school in 1966, before I took LSD and dropped out and became a hippie, I learned a little bit about law, torts, the judicial system. And I would only say there's two questions you should ask about law and order that's sold to you by your American media. Whose law and whose order? Whose law and whose order? And all you fools who sit there with that warm feeling in your heart about our great American judicial system, you think it's just. Well, there was a word that had been going around a few years about American justice, and it was a play on words. It was called justice. It really means just us. And those of you who think it is justice have bought the lie, hook, line, and sinker. And so when I wrote those words in Time of the Vulture in 2006, talking about the possibility of a new nation, of a new America version 2.0 that would be arise to lead the world once again with a moral leadership that it has abdicated in version 1.0, there were 4 markers. And I would say, by how we will see if these markers show whether or not America has gained the moral leadership to lead once again as it did in 1776. A leadership that was by example. A leadership that the Founding Fathers hoped would spark a revolution of other nations, of oppressed people around the world, to take their destinies once again into their own hands. But it was not to be. There was only one crown colony that was to arise and fight successfully the tyranny imposed by the King of England. It was the United States of America. All the other colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, are still under the yoke. One did fight and throw it off. England. Not England, India. The crown jewel of the English Empire. Non-violently, led by Gandhi. And yet even that nation is still basically owned by its former overlord, England. It is free in a manner of speaking. England still holds the gold that it took from India, even though there's a law on the Indian books saying the majority of India's gold has to be held domestically. And 2 years ago, a gentleman brought suit asking that this law be enforced. That suit went nowhere in India's courts of law. Because the courts of law are ruled not by justice, but by power. And this is why America 2.0 that I talked about in Time of the Vulture has not come to pass. Because the moral leadership, the moral choices have not been sufficiently made by those in America 1.0. Now, America 2.0 is coming. But it's not coming by volition. It is not coming by choice. I am going to say that an American Revolution is going to bring a new America into being. And it is going to happen in probably the closest thing to the American Revolution that we've had since then. It is going to happen because the American people are going to rise up once again against the tyranny imposed upon them, this time not by a foreign nation, England, a tyranny imposed upon them by the collusion of banking and the Democratic and Republican parties, which the bankers own on both sides. And it is going to come about. Why? It's going to come about because the collapse, the coming collapse of the American economy is going to be so devastating, so complete, and so catastrophic that those of you who have hoped against hope, that those in the political parties that you've chosen to give your vote for willingly have abandoned you to the whores that now run those parties. The prostitutes, the biggest prostitutes, are not those poor ladies who ply their trade after dark on the streets of America's cities because they feed their heroin habits or their children. No, the biggest prostitutes are those who serve as your elected officials. They're not all prostitutes, but I would say 98% are. And they've narrowed the choices. So you have voted them into office, hoping against hope, hoping against experience, that the next asshole you vote for is going to turn things around, unlike the last asshole you put there. Let me assure you, they won't. Because the system is rigged. And it's been rigged for decades. They've played party against party. So you run one side to the other, hoping, and you throw out the last people you put in, hoping that it would somehow be different than the ones before. You know what a fool is? That qualifies as a fool. The collapse, however, is going to bring it to an end. The American collapse of the economy is going to free you from the slavery you have bought.